I want a dynamic country where private enterprise carries the day, not the government. President Donald Trump. All right. Good morning. Welcome to another episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. I'm your host, DL, America's most objective libertarian. If you're tuning in live, thank you so much for giving me your time so early. All right, folks. So, yesterday we took a little detour in the podcast path. And instead of doing my weekly Donald Trump 47 weekly hits and misses, checking out like what's Trump been up to, and let's talk about it. And let's say, like, does Liberty Dad agree with this? Does he not agree? What nuances are to be found? Those sorts of things. Um, I took a slight detour to address some insider baseball with the Libertarian Party. And so, we're back at it now. So today's Thursday. We're going to just do what we were going to do yesterday to make sure that we have our 47 weekly. So that's where we are. Got a little behind today, this week in general. I talked about that yesterday on the show. Basically, of all my responsibilities, unfortunately, podcasting hits at the very bottom priority, or pretty close to the bottom of the priority list of other things, like family and work and, things like that. So, but anyway, we're back at it. So here we are. What are we going to talk about today? Let's dive in to this whole auto pen. So here's what Trump posted regarding the auto pen. Put that up on the screen. And that's a little small. I thought I made it bigger. Anyway, no worries. So here's what it says, and I'll definitely read it since it looks a little bit small on the screen to me. So I imagine it's much smaller to you. Uh, he said, other than rigged presidential election of 2020, the biggest scandal in American history is the quote auto pen, end quote. Whoever used it was usurping the power of the presidency, and it should be very easy to find out who that person or persons is. They did things that a Joe Biden, now this is very interesting. They did things that a Joe Biden of sound mind would have never done, like open borders, transgender for everyone, men and women's sports, and far more. Fear not, however, we will bring America back bigger, better, and stronger than ever before. So this is interesting because I want you to, like, initially much of the conversation about the auto pen was regarding the pardons that Biden made. And you were like, oh, well, especially with his son, right? Where people are like, well, wait a minute. Does he have sound mind? Is this what he would really do? And you can make an argument that, hey, if you're the president and your son is in trouble, you might give him a pardon. Um, and so that was questioned, but now Trump seems to be like from the uh the, the bully pulpit in a sense, suggesting that many official actions beyond just signing pardons was maybe illegitimate. And so like that takes it in a whole new direction because it's like, well, wait a minute, what things exactly? And what's to be done about it? So let's see here. We got another. He actually came. He had another tweet too. Nope. Is that it? Nope. Okay, we'll hold off on that one. So let me. Sorry, I'm jumping a little bit ahead. I think he had some other tweets, and I wanted to follow something up. But first, let me read this article. Got a little disorganized here. That's okay. We'll get back on track here. All right. So here's this article from CBN. I thought this was interesting. Um, Biden cover up question mark. Congress wants answers about the auto pen and his mental state in office. And this was yesterday. So let's see. The book Original Sin by journalists Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson has shaken official Washington with its in depth look at the efforts by White House and Democratic officials to cover up Joe Biden's obvious mental decline. The authors provide numerous examples, including a town hall event staged by the 2024 campaign that went south. Joe Biden's town hall, which was closed to press, was so bad that campaign officials determined that it was not usable for a campaign commercial, says Original Sin author Alex Thompson. Now, that's an interesting claim. And I think the American people deserve an answer. I mean, after all, a lot of people were talking about Joe Biden's mental state of mind, his mental health for a long time. And I'll show you in a moment for years. We're not talking about like this short area of like a month or two. And we're like, wait a minute. We're not talking about one offs where he had this weird, awkward moment, as people might have. And we just ran with it because that's what tends to happen, right? The media will run with something, the mob, if you will. Uh, is it netizens, citizens of the internet? People like, people will influencers and whatnot and groups will, run with an idea and then maybe it turns out not to be true or whatever, right? There's some nuance that people ignored. Um, but like I think the American people do deserve an answer as to when did we know that Biden was not mentally fit to maintain his duties and what kind of decisions were made by those around him, right? And I mean, this is a particular interesting claim here, specifically saying like this particular event was so bad they were like, don't use it. Like, that's an interesting claim, and I'd like to know, right? Because he was our president, he was signing official documents, like that needs to be addressed. And what's interesting about Trump's comment is that he's like Joe Biden in his proper mental state would never have done that. So that's an interesting take. Anyway, goes on and says, yet the president's top strategist and family members, known in the book as the Politburo, looked the other way and dismissed it. Chris Whipple, author of the best-selling book Uncharted, that documented the 2024 campaign, has similar stories from his White House sources. Whipple recounts one story of Biden preparing at Camp David before the infamous debate disaster against Donald Trump. Remember that debate? Like, everybody that was watching it was groaning. We were like, "Oh no. Like what?" And even in the middle of the debate, at one point, Trump made a kind of like a swipe at Biden. He said something like, "I don't even know if he knows what he's saying." He's like, "I don't know what he's saying. I don't even know if he knows what he's saying." Something like that. And so that was kind of it. Like, again, this is so his mental fitness, this was not some weird conspiracy theory. I mean, people might like to portray it that way, and at one point they probably did, but the reality is it occurred over a series of years. And many, many people noticed this and were raising the flag and saying, "Hey, this is a problem. Something's not right." Goes on in this article. He wandered out at one point to the pool and sank into a lounge chair and fell down to sleep. And yet the Biden camp kept sailing toward that iceberg, the debate, Whipple tells CBN News. Whipple isn't convinced this amounts to a full fledged Watergate style cover up. He thinks it's more about Biden's top aides becoming more delusional and convinced that Biden was the only Democrat who could beat Trump. The stunning thing, they're quoting, the stunning thing to me is that nobody ever sat Joe Biden down and said, "Mr. President, you sure about this?" Perhaps not so stunning is how much of the legacy media covered it up too. One of the authors of Original Sin, CNN's Jake Tapper, has been called out during the book tour for looking the other way during the campaign and now cashing in by writing a book about it. Megyn Kelly confronted him directly about it on her recent podcast. Quote, "There was no effort, none, to get to the bottom of this," end quote, she told him. "And now you write this book. There was a cover up. There was an attempted cover up, and it could only ever work if you allowed it. The press allowed it." So this is a very interesting article. And I encourage you to really look into it and evaluate. If you're like, look, you don't have to be a Trump supporter. You could even be a Democrat and you should be kind of angry because at no time should the candidate who represents you ever be considered. Well, let me put it this way. Uh, you should not want at any time somebody that has represented you to be put into question. Because if they signed legislation, if they did particular actions that you supported, those could be undone simply simply on the basis of, hey, this person wasn't in the right state of mind. Now, here's the catch. You can't just necessarily undo things. I'm going to talk about that in just a second here. Right? So it's not like Trump can come in and say, I have reviewed enough information about Biden to say that he was mentally unfit. So therefore, all of his past stuff is undone. It's not really how it works. I'll tell you how that kind of works in just a moment. Let's continue on with my slideshow because I want to point out, I said this was known for years. So I want to make sure that we're clear. So I went and I dug some stuff back up here. So here we go. All right. So this is a tweet or post from the leading report back in 2023. This is breaking. The former White House physician for Presidents Obama and Trump, Representative Ronnie Jackson, says Biden does not have the cognitive ability to serve another term. Now, I don't know to what degree that this particular physician is able to make that assessment, because I presume if he was a former physician, then he does not have access to the sitting president's medical history. All right, but because he evaluates presidents and because he's a physician, he may be able to spot some things even through video and say, that's not right. Something's up. Something doesn't make, things aren't adding up here. We can probably say that. Could he give a full-fledged mental report or health report? No. Could he give even a partial one? Probably not. Right? Not an official one. But it's kind of like if you're good at what you do, you can identify things even before you confirm them. You can be like, yeah, based on these things, I'm led to believe this. Right? So I think the physician could make that. But this, more importantly, down here at the bottom, you see it was in 2023, in November of 2023. All right. So let's look at the next one here. So this one comes from 2022, back in January. Now, I just randomly picked accounts. I tried to pick accounts that were at least blue check, and that we at least kind of know who they are. Right. So this is Bridget Gabriel. She says Joe Biden is mentally unfit to be president. Okay. Now, what we're not doing here, we're not saying the people in these tweets are capable of making that determination. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm showing here is that we can go back and we can look and we can see that people were questioning this for a long time. People were concerned about it. Sometimes if we go and we look at it and we say, okay, why did you say President Biden was mentally unfit? They might say something stupid, and that's fine. And we can ignore that particular person and say, okay, the evidence that you're presenting that leads you to that conclusion is bad, even though the conclusion in itself may ultimately be correct. Okay. Then we go on and we see that Juanita Broderick, she said Joe Biden is not mentally or physically capable of handling the job of president. Calling a lid will be the norm. And then that was posted in 2021 in January. Okay. So like we're going back to 2021 when people are talking about his mental fitness. Then we got Cat Turd, again, not giving credence necessarily to their opinion so much as I'm pointing out that during a certain time frame, people were talking about this. Joe Biden isn't fit mentally or physically to be president. He's making an absolute fool of himself. This was back in 2020. Now, again, we can quibble all we want with whether or not these particular people are, have the capability of any kind whatsoever to make such a statement. That's not what I'm arguing. Again, so I'm not arguing that Cat Turd was right and we should listen to Cat Turd. What I'm arguing is that Cat Turd was one of among many people that were questioning Joe Biden's mental fitness all the way back to 2020. So somewhere, let's use that point in time, 2020, somewhere between 2020 and 2024, some and possibly earlier, but at least in this time frame, somebody was accurate. Somebody was correct that his mental fitness was not up to par. Now, how far or how low, how do I want to say it? How far up to par? Where where it actually was is unknown, right? If we're looking at it in percentages, we could say, okay, well, maybe he was only 90% unfit or he was 90% fit. Okay, that's not too bad. And maybe there's not much to worry about. But what if he was 30%, right? What if he was only operating at 30%? And the Joe Biden that we saw was, as people were making comments about, they were suggesting that he was on all kind of cocktails. Was he? I don't know, right? But this is something that should be found out. And to be honest, I mean, we should investigate. Congress should investigate, not because we want to undo all the stuff and but because the American people deserve answers. Now, is this to the level of Watergate? I mean, would it undo his whole presidency? I don't know about all that. Okay. But we don't know. That's the problem. We don't know to what extent he was incapable of doing the job. And what's more important than that is who's responsible if he was. So if he was considered mentally unfit and people were acting on his behalf, essentially, who are those people? And who are the people that were lying to the American public? They need to be punished somehow, whether it's by the law or by the anger of the American public, who will say you should never again have any seat at the table of authority, at the table of power, right? Because they clearly were untrustworthy with it. So I think that's a good way to look at it, is just to say we need more information. Now, in terms of what can be done, I did a little research and I believe this is all accurate. So there are four areas for which we should consider: executive actions, legislative actions, regulations, and judicial review. Okay. So let me read to you. I'm not gonna put it on the screen. Just let me read to you. Um, for executive actions, a president can reverse or modify their predecessors' executive orders, memoranda, or other unilateral actions by simply issuing new executive actions, right? And we see that all the time. That happens regardless of the mental state of the prior president. Like, you can go back and you can look, you say, just type into Google, what executive orders did Trump undo? What executive orders from Biden did Trump undo? And then you can be like, which ones did Biden undo from Trump, and so on and so forth, right? And there's always a list of them, right? And they just go back and they rescind them, basically. So that's pretty common. Trump could do that, and he does. It doesn't matter whether Biden was mentally fit or not. On executive actions like that, Trump has the power to undo them, plain and simple. The next one is legislation. So this would be legislation that President Biden signed. Now, Trump really has nothing that he can do. Actions codified into law cannot be undone by a president alone. Repealing or amending laws requires congressional action and the current president's signature, or a veto override by House by I'm sorry by both houses of Congress. So if Biden signed legislation into he signed legislation into law, and we determined like, hey, it wasn't actually him signing it. Maybe it was the auto pen that signed it, and it wasn't him, and somebody else, kind of pretended that Biden had signed it. Okay, well, it's still law. It doesn't get undone. The president can't undo it, and as far as I know, the courts cannot undo it. But Congress can undo it. Now, the courts could evaluate that law in the same way they do any other law. So they can look and say, was it constitutional or not? But to my knowledge, they cannot just make a determination. If there was an official body that came out and said officially, Joe Biden was mentally unfit as of this date and every moment going forward. If that was the case, the Supreme Court still, to my knowledge, could not use that and say, okay, we're declaring everything unconstitutional or what have you. They can only rule based on the way that they normally would operate, which is to say, okay, what does the Constitution say? What past cases have been ruled? What other laws are in place? So on and so forth. Right? Like they can review this and then determine whether or not a piece of legislation is legitimate. I don't want to say legitimate, but is constitutional. But otherwise, any repeal, any amendments to the laws would require a congressional action, which is interesting because if you think about it, it was a congressional action that got him to the desk of the president. So we have a different and it's possible that the Congress could undo them, right? Because you have different members in Congress. Whether it really depends on what the legislation is, what the motivation is by the current Congress, how much of the current Congress was part of the prior Congress. I think we're on the 119th. So how much of the 119th Congress was also the 118th Congress under Joe Biden, and how did they vote? Because if a large number of the yes votes for a piece of legislation were in the prior Congress, and they're also in those same members are now in the current Congress, there's a good chance that they will not vote to overturn or to to repeal or to amend. But it's possible they could. But anyway, it requires Congress. Regulations. Federal regulations issued under a prior administration can be modified through the rulemaking process under the Administrative Procedure Act, which involves public notice, comment periods, and potential legal challenges. This process is time consuming and it's subject to judicial review. Speaking of judicial review, if a prior president's action is challenged as unconstitutional or unlawful, courts can invalidate it. However, a current president cannot directly initiate this. A legal challenge must come from a party with standing. In other words, individuals, states, organizations. Like it'd be like me saying, "Hey, this law prevented me from doing something, or this law was the reason I got punished, and I'm challenging it because I don't think this law was unconstitutional." That would be a part. I would be a party with standing. So judicial review is basically the same as it was, same as it always is. Doesn't change based on the prior president's mental state. Um, and then I forgot this one earlier. Appointments. A president cannot undo a prior president's confirmed appointments, federal judges, Supreme Court justices, etc., unless the appointee resigns, is impeached, or their term expires. Now, keep in mind, these appointees go through Congress, right? Like Congress has to review them and say, they go through the Senate and they have a hearing, and then the Senate votes, and then they either confirm or deny the appointee, the nominee, right? So I point all that out to reiterate checks and balances. That's how our government works, through checks and balances. And so even though the president might have been unfit, if we look back and we see, okay, well, he signed this piece of legislation even though he was unfit, chances are that legislation might have went through anyway whether he was, even if he was fit, because number one, Congress would have been the reason that it got to his desk in the first place. And then Congress could override him. And if he had a good working relationship with Congress prior to any moment we've determined where he was mentally unfit, then we could say, okay, we could make the argument and say the likelihood is that he would have supported this legislation. Or if we look back and we say, okay, during these times where there was no question of his mental abilities, um, then we could look and say, was he talking about this particular issue? Where did he say he stood? Like if Biden campaigned on something and then Congress happened to finally get around to drafting legislation and get it to his desk, but by the time that actually happened, he was mentally unfit. I would argue, I'm not a fan of President Biden. I would argue though, hey, that even though he might have auto penned it, we do have evidence that he would have signed it himself. And I think that's important. Now you could argue and say, but DL, it's not proper for the president to have something signed on his behalf when he's mentally unfit. But we don't have a mechanism to evaluate that and say, well, he was unfit. Here's now all of our processes. No, we have to follow all the same processes as before. So I thought that was interesting to point out because there's been some conversation about the auto pen and what was he permitted to do, what was he not permitted to do. At the end of the day, personally, I don't think any of it matters. I mean, it does, but I don't think like I considering that we would have to go through the same processes to undo anything. I think the only thing that really matters for the American people is the knowledge of what happened, because then the American people can get angry and hopefully they can kick out people that were in power that were doing these things. Because at the end of the day, like whether you agree with the size of government, whether you agree with the Republicans or the Democrats, whatever, any of that stuff, at the end of the day, we do have a system and we should all want that system to operate as it was intended, because when we operate as intended, everybody is familiar with the rules. And when everybody's familiar with the rules, then at least we're all playing the same game under the same rules. And if people start usurping the rules or start doing their own thing, they need to be held accountable somehow. So for me, I would actually say I don't know I don't think that the president has a lot of power, or maybe he does. I'm not sure. I should have looked this one up. But if the president has the power to investigate and then determine, okay, on this particular date, President Biden was unfit, and then make that, and then some formal body makes that declaration. And so now it becomes, like something formal and proper, not just like the president saying so. We've got to do more than that. So I think he can initiate an investigation, but some other body has to make this declaration and say, based on these facts, this is where we land on this particular situation. Then after that, I think it would be fair to say, all right, who knew and what did they do? And if they did something they shouldn't have done and they knew about it, they should be punished. To me, that's where this whole auto pen needs to go. That's where I think it should go. Because if we don't punish people for doing bad things while they're in office or while they're in power of some kind, then we're just going to get more of the same. And so that's where the American people should, if you the audience, when you're thinking about this, whether you like Trump, whether you love Trump, whether you know love Biden, hate Biden, whatever, this is really not about either one of them. This is about, are we playing by the rules of the game? Right? Are people lying to the American public? Are people taking and using power that was never granted to them? If somebody signed something on the president's behalf when he was unable to consent, they have stolen his power. They have taken the power of the president upon themselves. They should be punished because no American voted for that person, right? And I know we get into this whole, when a president gets elected, we're all like, oh, they've got a mandate. Again, mandates are fine, and I understand that rhetoric. To some degree, there's a little truth to that. But number one, they're not kings, right? Everything they want doesn't get to happen. We still have rule of law. We still have checks and balances. We still have a process that happens that has to be followed. That is important. So, all right. So that's what I got to say about the auto pay. All right. So let's move on. Let's talk the next one, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Let's take a look and see what we've got there. So do. So here's President Trump again. And man, I don't know why I made these so small, but I'll work on that. We'll get this improved. He says, I'm giving very serious consideration to bringing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac public. I will be speaking with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick, and the Director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency William Pulte, among others, and will be making a decision in the near future. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are doing very well, throwing off a lot of cash, and the time would seem to be right. Stay tuned. So then he goes on, and so that was one tweet, and then a few days later, he made a follow-up tweet where he said, uh, our great mortgage agencies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, provide a vital service to our nation by helping hardworking Americans reach the American dream, home ownership. I am working on taking these amazing companies public, but I want to be clear. The U.S. government will keep its implicit guarantees, and I will stay strong in my position on overseeing them as president. These agencies are now doing very well and will help us to make America great again. Okay, so this could be a very contentious topic, right? Because it's like on one hand, you've got this government backing, and it's like, should the government, in terms of libertarian perspective, whenever you say should the government, the answer is almost always no. If you're an anarchist, it is always no, right? So, um, should the government be overseeing how Freddie Mae and and Fannie Mac? Should they be running it? And I say no. It should absolutely be in the private sector. Now, should the government keep its guarantees? And I say also, no, it shouldn't. Because to me, when you put something in the free market, but then you hold on all these guarantees or you heavily regulate it, well, then it's kind of like in the free market in name only. Free market in name only. Can we make an acronym out of that? FAMINO. That's basically what it ends up being. And so it's like pretend free market. So here I got an article. I thought this was kind of interesting. This article is actually from 2012. Now, if you're a regular audience member of this show, you know that I love going back and reviewing what articles and what things were said about a particular topic from years ago. So the reason I do that is when something gets in the news, a lot of times there's a lot of heated debate about it, right? That's what kind of makes it popular in the news. And so there's usually only two sides. Sometimes there's a third or fourth, but usually there's only two sides. And the two sides are quarreling about which way to perceive this particular issue or which direction in which to go, what's going to be good, what's going to be bad, so on and so forth. And because it's so hotly contested, everybody's basically tripping over themselves to basically say, all right, if you're consuming this, whether it's a video or an article, if you're consuming this, I want to convince you right away before you finish consuming this that my opinion is the right opinion, right? And so they go through great lengths to and in doing so, what often happens is we miss some critical details, some nuance that could help people make a decision. Because sometimes if you're looking at right and left, the right might be saying one thing, the left might be saying one thing, and perhaps maybe the left is right this time, perhaps the right is correct this time, or perhaps the truth, as often is the case, is somewhere in the middle. And so then we need to take a little bit from the left and a little bit from the right and figure it out and say, okay, this is where the truth really lies. This is our real direction. This is what we should do. So let me read this article. Here it is on the screen. 7 things you need to know about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And so this is from American Progress, which I believe is a left-leaning think tank. But that's okay because in my research, I determined that this information was largely truthful, largely accurate. So Fannie and Freddie remain two of the world's largest financial institutions, but most Americans understand very little about the two mortgage giants. This was back in 2012. It is now 2025. I'm willing to bet this same sentence would be applicable today. That Most Americans understand very little about the two mortgage giants. They don't understand it. So the president is considering putting it on the free market, right? A lot of his base, they're going to cheer. Then the real question is, are they cheering for what they understand or are they just cheering for their guy? I think in most cases, they're probably cheering for their guy. So what we do on this show, we try to inform ourselves to the best we can. I'm not going to read the whole article. It's in the show notes. You can go check it out. I'm just going to read some of the highlights that I thought were interesting. Exactly 4 years ago, again, this is 2012. Exactly 4 years ago, during the early days of the financial crisis, the federal government took control of mortgage financiers Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac through a legal process called conservatorship. Since then, the two companies have required roughly $150 billion in taxpayer support to stay solvent, while the government has kept the housing market afloat by backing more than 95% of all home loans made in the United States. Do you see a problem already? Right? Like this is back in 2012, okay? And they're writing in 2012 and they're like since 2008, over the last 4 years, the companies required $150 billion in taxpayer support. That's not good, okay? That is like that is and that begs now maybe the case is today that they don't require it. Maybe they get it, but they don't require it, whatever, right? I didn't look into that. But the real question is, could we get to a situation where the government looks and says, "Oh, we got to go back to the conservatorship"? Is that because we don't want that? We don't want to put it on the free market and put guarantees out there from the government, and then say, "Oh, okay, well, uh, we need to reassume control, conservatorship as we once did because it's just not doing well in the market." At some point, we let entities fail, and when we don't let them fail, then one, we don't have a free market, and number two, we really distort the the value of things because when something fails in the free market, yes, people can be hurt. Like the bigger it is, the harder it's gonna hit. The harder it's gonna hit more people, right? But the people that are controlling it learn a lesson. We shouldn't do that, whatever that is. And as long as the government is bailing them out or assisting them, subsidizing them in some way, then they will continue to make poor decisions. Put it this way, let's make it more simple. Let's say I decide to start a restaurant. Okay? And we have two paths that can be followed. A and B. On path A, it's completely free market. So I got to figure out how to get customers. I got to figure out how to make tasty food. I got to figure out how to advertise. I've got to figure out where to get my staff. How should they be trained? What should the environment of the restaurant look like? Is it going to be high end? Is it going to be low end? Is it going to be a burger shop? Whatever, all these different places, all these different things. Then I also have to say, okay, what's the competition look like? What are they? If I make a burger joint, let's say I make a really fun burger joint. Well, I'm going to have to say, okay, what are the other burger joints around here doing? How many are there? Is the market saturated? Does it really want one more burger joint? Right. And so I have to make all these decisions. And let's say I make decisions that lead me to a nice opening and then a nice first 6 months. Right. It's novel. People are coming to the restaurant. They really like it. Okay. But now, and we're making assumptions here. So don't hold me to any of these numbers or time frames. But let's say 6 months later, the novelty starts wearing off. Well, now I got to figure out, okay, how do I compete against everybody else that's already on the market? Okay. My novelty is worn off. Now I'm starting to be at the same level as everybody else. Okay. We've been there. We've tried that. Yeah, it was pretty good. But I really do like this place over here. I got to figure out how do I get that person coming to my place? Or how do I get people that are going somewhere else, maybe not a burger joint, to come to my joint? Right. Those are all considerations I have to make. If I make bad decisions, I will go under. Now, it's possible that I could come back, right? And having learned my lesson, make better decisions. That happens too. Okay. But the fact of the matter is, I have to learn a lesson. In order to learn a lesson, I have to be subject to profits and losses. See, that's the funny thing about the free market. People that don't like the free market, people that hate capitalism, they always whine and cry about profits. But they're also some of the same people that will go out and support legislation that prevents people from dealing with the losses. Well, you're getting a distorted version of capitalism. Okay, now let's take path B, right? Path B is and we're making things up just to illustrate the point. I decide that I'm going to start a restaurant. I managed to find a way. There's a government program that will subsidize my business for like 5 years, maybe 10 years, whatever, right? It subsidizes it. Well, guess what? Because it's being subsidized, money's coming in, right, in some way, or something is being done for me so that I do not have to utilize my resources to acquire whatever that is. Let's just say it's money, right? I get a sir, and let's say it's not even a full on, we're gonna pay all your bills. We're just gonna give you like 50%. Right? And let's make it lower than that. 25%. Let's say 25% of labor is paid for. That's my subsidy. This is I'm getting a subsidy for 5 or 10 years. 25% of labor is being paid for. That's awesome, right? Well, guess what? Because that 25% is being paid for, it's subsidized, it's being taken care of by the government, it's guaranteed. That means that's 25% I don't have to worry about. So now I can worry about the other 75%, which on the surface might sound good, but the reality is it affects the choices that I make. My choices are no longer going to be the same as they were in path A because I know that I can rely on the 25% that I need, and I only have to worry about the other 75%. So now, whether this subsidy lasts 5 years or 10 years, let's say it ends. Let's say the government's like, all right, we got you going, we got you a good run. Now you're on your own. If it's been 5 years or 10 years that I've been under that umbrella, well, then guess what? That's 5 or 10 years for which I have been accustomed to making certain decisions. I am not used to making hard decisions in a brutal free market. And let's be clear, the free market is absolutely brutal. This is why I tell people, I'm like, people get mad and they're like, well, the government should make a law about this or that. Like this company shouldn't have a sign that says whites only, which on the surface sounds good. But I promise you, the free market, way more brutal to that kind of thing than government could ever be. Because government will just basically say, you can't do it. The free market could go along and then all of a sudden, and we've seen this, the free market could be people from in other states giving you bad reviews and just really distorting your business so that it gets a bad reputation. And then now people don't want to go there. Right. And it might be for something that's benign, or it could be something that's very serious. Right. We've seen there was that story a while back in was it Fort Wayne? I think it was Fort Wayne, Indiana. There was a pizza shop and some reporter came in and they asked the pizza shop. And I think it was just a regular like hostess or something. Like they were not the owner. And they were like, would you deliver pizza to a gay wedding? This was back when there was the bake the cake argument. And I think the girl said like, "No, we wouldn't. We're a Christian company," or something like that. And that's what they ran with, right? They didn't ask the owner; they just asked one of the employees, and they ran with it. And man, I tell you what, the free market treated them brutally. People were like just annihilating them on Yelp and Google review and all those places where, companies rely on the reviews and the ratings from the public. Uh, People were just going in and creating fake profiles or using their own profile, to give them bad ratings and reviews. And you get enough of them, somebody like me is going to have a hard time determining, like what's real, what's not, right? Because I'm not going to go through and try to read them all and go, oh, this person, they're probably just some person from another state making stuff up, right? So I may just not want. I may choose, or I may choose not to go there because of that, or I may choose not to go just because I'm like, you know what, um, seems too controversial. I don't really want to have anything to do with it, so therefore I'm not going to go. Right. So these things have a negative impact. So the free market is absolutely brutal. And going back to this comment here, you know, the companies at one point were requiring $150 billion in taxpayer support to remain solvent. That's a problem. That means there's some sort of uh, functioning that is not working correctly. I don't know what it is. And it could be multiple things. It could be that the businesses are not or were not run properly. And it could be that you had bad legislation. Because sometimes bad legislation does lead to problems. Again, as I said a moment ago, if you have a bunch of legislation, you have a bunch of regulation from some agency that's overseeing something that's supposed to be in the free market, it distorts what the free market can actually do. And so it doesn't give us a good sense of things. And so sometimes regulation requires more regulation. It's kind of like a lie. Like, you ever told a lie and then through that lie you realize that you had to tell another lie because there was like a hole in the first lie that you told. So then you told another lie to follow up with it, and then maybe had to tell another lie, right? And depending on the nature of this, the situation, you could be telling multiple lies. Like if you're a guy and you have a girl and you've been cheating on her, and she's like, "Man, you've been coming home late," and then so you lie about coming home late, and then she runs into one of your coworkers who's like, "Yeah, it's great leaving the office early every day." And then she's like, "Well, wait a minute." So then you might have to tell another lie about why, your coworker said that people have been leaving early except for you, right? And so then something else might happen and you might have to lie about that. You might Okay, so now you've got all these lies and you got to try to juggle them. And at some point all those lies come crashing down. Well, regulation is basically the same thing. You get one regulation, it distorts something. It doesn't give you, it makes people, it causes people to behave in ways that they might not ordinarily behave, right? Which, if you're partially into the free market, I have one foot in the free market, one foot out of the free market. The foot that's out of the free market is trying to deal with the regulation. What that means is half of my energy is dealing with what the free market wants. The other half is dealing with what the regulation demands. And because I'm trying to do those things, they are going to conflict and they are going to cause problems. Now, if you're big enough, it may not be such a big deal. This tends to be very obvious for smaller things, but even big entities run into problems, as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac did. All right, let's continue on. Again, I'm not going to read the whole article. You can go read it for yourself, but I thought there were some pertinent highlights here. So, number one, what do Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac do? Since we already established that many Americans probably don't know a whole lot about them. The primary function of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is to provide liquidity to the nation's mortgage finance system. Fannie and Freddie purchase home loans made by private firms, provided the loans meet strict size, credit, and underwriting standards. They package those loans into mortgage-backed securities and guarantee the timely payout of principal and interest on those securities to outside investors. Fannie and Freddie also hold some home loans and mortgage securities in their own investment portfolios. So basically, they are helping to manage the nation's mortgage finance system. They're a big deal, right? Like, they play a critical role in our mortgage system that we have in this country. So, not a small thing. This is why, when it comes to something like this, we better get it right. So, let's see. Scroll down here, skipping some of this stuff. All right. Under why did Fannie and Freddie require a taxpayer bailout? Fannie and Freddie failed in large part because they made bad business decisions and held insufficient capital. Also, unlike most private investment firms, Fannie and Freddie had only one line of business, residential mortgage finance, and thus did not have other sources of income to compensate when home prices began to fall. In other words, they were poorly managing their businesses. Now, I haven't looked into it, but I'm willing to bet that if we go and we look into it, we will see that in part, some of those bad decisions more than likely had something to do with regulations at the time or legislation. There was likely some, because this is almost always the case when you go and you look at something and you say, okay, why did they do this? Oh, looks like they were doing this because the government demanded that they do something. So they went out and they were meeting the government's demands, right? Well, whether the government demand was inappropriate or not, and I mean that in terms of business sense, not necessarily appropriate for the government to be involved in, but in a business sense, whether it was appropriate or not, it is distorting the market, because It is not necessarily the government is not making regulations necessarily based on market demand. They are making regulations and decisions on things based on how can we protect people? How can we serve the interest of someone, whether it's allegedly the American public or it's a special interest? So this when libertarians talk about the free market, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are a good example of exactly how the market can get distorted. And it would be a good exercise for Americans to just dive into and read about them, learn as much as they can, and then say, okay, hopefully they would say this, I get it. I understand why government involvement in the market can actually make things worse or put them at powder keg status. So this is why whatever Trump does it could go well, it could go bad. A lot of it, the devil is in the details. Okay. Let's continue on. I think there's a few more here. One or two more. Okay. What should we do with Fannie and Freddie? Now, again, this is written in 2012, so all of this may not be as applicable today. With the federal government backing nearly every home loan made in the country today, almost everyone agrees that the current level of support is unsustainable in the long run. Well, we're in the long run now, and private capital will eventually have to assume more risk in the mortgage market. Okay. I'm okay with this. Private capital should be the one putting taking risk in the marketplace, not taxpayer dollars. That should not ever be at risk. The government should never, ever lose money, right? Unless you want to talk about, like, say, a natural disaster. So if you have a nice, beautiful park that the government has built for their city and they spent some taxpayer dollars on it, and then a hurricane comes through, since I'm in Florida, a hurricane comes through and wipes it out. And so then the government loses all that money. Okay. That wasn't like, to me, that's an acceptable loss at that level too, specifically a park at the local level. That would be an acceptable loss. If the government is managing an entity or overseeing an entity or heavily regulating an industry, and that industry falters because those regulations were mismatched with what the market is demanding, that is not an acceptable loss. Or more, if we're going to be more accurate, if the government has itself invested taxpayer money in a thing, right? And that investment comes obviously with regulations and requirements and so on and so forth, things that may or may not be applicable on the free market. For example, if the government is paying for something, like, let's say, go back to my restaurant example. Let's say the government is subsidizing me and they're subsidizing my labor. Well, because they're subsidizing my labor, as a libertarian, I would argue that they can say, you know what? You have to hire proportional demographics proportional to the demographics of the city. So if there's 10% of the city is black people, 10% of my employees, they could demand be black, right? So on and so forth. And the government can do that if they're paying for it, because the government cannot be in any way associated with discrimination, because the government is power. The government has a power that no other entity has in this country. The government has a monopoly on force. That is why discrimination from the government perspective, from a government entity, is not acceptable. However, on a completely free market, if we had it running the way I say we should, then businesses could hire and fire for any reason they want. You could have one company that hires only white people and one company that only hires black people, right? For whatever reason. Maybe it's a good reason. Maybe it's a terrible reason, right? Maybe a black business owner says, hey, you know what? Um, I would like to create a business that a restaurant that caters some black cuisine that is common in the black community, right? We're gonna we're gonna call it the barbecue, and we're inviting, but all of our employees are gonna be black so that it's authentic, right? And all of our black folk here are familiar with cooking this food, right? So they're not just black, but they actually have the skills necessary to make this particular business work. Okay, that would be fine, just as fine as if it legally fine, just as fine as a white business saying, you know what, I don't like me some not white people, so therefore I'm going to exclude anybody who's not white from my restaurant. And then white people can say, well, I think that's a good idea, and they can go there. Or they could say, that's a terrible idea, and I refuse to do business with you. Right? On the free market, that would be acceptable. That would be good. And the free market can decide whether or not the reasons, what somebody did and the reasons behind it are good or not. That's how a free market would work. But the government can't do that. The government doesn't have that option because the government is taking money from white people, black people, Asian people, so on and so forth. Right. And because they're taking money from everybody, that means they have, and because they have a monopoly on force, they have to stay away from discrimination because it would not be proper. Number one, it's not proper to take money from citizens. But then after you take money from, say, a black person, and then you give some of that money to an entity that doesn't want to serve black people. So basically, you are paying somebody to be racist with the person's money that's being that's receiving the racism. That is immoral. So the government cannot do that, right? And so this is the problem. So yes, the private capital does need to assume more risk. These are all things that are part of that risk, right? And now I made some chintzy kind of analogies because I'm trying not to get too bogged down into the real estate market, But ultimately, if somebody wants to give a loan for particular reasons, or they don't want to give loans for particular reasons, then from my world, from the libertarian perspective, it's their money. They can do what they want with it because they might lose that money. So they have to make a decision and say, what is in the best interest of me not losing this money, this investment? Okay. But we've also had, because it says here, with the federal government backing nearly every home loan made in the country today. Well, the question is, how many home loans are now being backed by the federal government? Is it the same today in 2025 as it was in 2012, where they were backing nearly every home loan? Okay. So this could be a problem putting it back out on the free market all of a sudden. And so we're likely to incur some issues. Even if we do it gently, there are still going to be some problems, more than likely. So that leaves, I'm going back to reading this now. That leaves two critical questions before policymakers today. What sort of presence should the federal government have in a future housing market? And how do we transition responsibly to this new system of housing finance? Trump hasn't made that information public yet. He's just saying, like, I'm considering doing this and I can appreciate it. So I'm all good with it. However, the question is, like, how is this going to be done? What kind of guarantees is the government going to impose? Will this ultimately end up being a situation where and I think the answer is going to be yes, but where the government says, okay, we're putting this back into the private sector, but only partially. Here's all the rules and regulations. Here's all of our guarantees. And so then it may be the 1 foot in, 1 foot out, where basically now this private capital is making decisions that are not based on market demand, but they're making decisions that are trying to balance market demand and government requirements. And because those two things are at odds, market demands, government requirements, they could run into problems in the future. And so we could simply have another 2008. So it's hard to say. Let's go down. Let's continue. I think there's one more. No, there's a couple more here. So under what would happen if we fully privatized the U.S. mortgage market? It's a good question. This is something we should be asking. Many conservative analysts, and politicians resorting to heated rhetoric and mistruths about the origin of the crisis argue that we need a fully private mortgage market run by Wall Street. It was the fully private segment of the market, however, that caused millions of foreclosures and brought down the entire financial system. If we draw the wrong lesson from the financial crisis and abruptly withdraw the government from mortgage finance, it will lead to a sharp reduction in the availability of home loans, cutting off access to mortgage finance for the middle class. Now, I want to be very careful here because I'm going to throw something out just as a thought. I don't want you to take it too serious, but just keep it in your mind. Remember the whole 2030, you will own nothing and you will be happy. And then that kind of fizzled out. And then we were talking about, what was that? The 2025, what's that called? It was the conservative think tank. where they had the 2025 goals or whatever. And so I kind of have to wonder if in 2012 we were saying that withdrawing the government could lead to a reduction in available home loans, which means few less availability for the middle class. Could that lead to a world where people are owning fewer and fewer things? I mean, it is only 2025, and President Trump is talking about this. And so perhaps, and I'm not presenting this in a scheme sense, but perhaps that is the goal. And there are opportunists out there that are looking, what moves can we make? And somebody might say, hey, this would be a good move. Remember what happened to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? Well, we could put it back out on the free market, and if we do it in a certain way, that will cause people to be restricted from a housing market or limited to the housing market, and so that could go toward this goal. Just a possibility. Throwing that out there. Let's continue on. History is a helpful guide here. Prior to the introduction of the government guarantee on residential mortgages in the 1930s, mortgages typically had 50% down payment requirements, short durations, and high interest rates, putting homeownership out of reach for many middle class families. Now, I can't go back. I haven't had time to go back and look and evaluate this information, so I'm going to take it at face value. The housing finance system was subject to frequent panics during which depositors demanded cash from their banks, leaving lenders insolvent. That volatility is one reason why every other developed economy in the world has deep levels of government support for residential mortgage finance. So this could be its own podcast itself, like its own episode to talk about the history. But going back and looking at, okay, what did the free market look like then? Now they say, and here it says, where did it say here? Where did I see it here? Yeah, okay. It was the fully private segment of the market. Now, I don't know that we've had a fully private segment for a very, very long time. And I would argue, like, and I'm not going to get into it, but I would argue that there were plenty of regulations and demands from the government that basically null and voided this comment. It was a fully private segment of the market. I don't think it was. We haven't seen a fully private segment of the market for anything in a very long time. So skip that nonsense. But it's still useful to go back and look at history and say, what was happening before these things existed, right? How did it look? What regulations were in place? When we look back, what do we think that the regulations caused or didn't cause? Because if they caused bad things, if they led to bad results, we certainly don't want to repeat them. If they led to good results, then we might want to repeat them. It depends. Is the situation the same? What was the nature of those regulations? Right. In most cases, I would probably argue that if you say here's a regulation, I'm going to probably start with it's not a good one. More than likely, right? Unless that regulation has something to do with like preventing fraud or maintaining transparency, those kind of things. Because I can only consent to taking on a mortgage if I'm fully informed. So if there's a regulation that says, hey, you have to provide DL with a bullet point list of everything that he has to consider before accepting this loan. Okay, that's a fair regulation. I would support that. That is about transparency. That is ensuring that I am a fully informed person before I sign my name on this document. So it depends. But I think this article is capturing the value of what do we need to do before President Trump does this. Even though I do like the idea of putting things on the free market, we do have to be careful when we're shifting from government oversight to free market, even partial free market, which is almost a guarantee of what it would actually be. All right. Conclusion. To be sure, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were flawed companies that made several bad business decisions, and taxpayers should never again have to foot the bill for any financial institution's greed. Okay. They are progressive, this site. So this is where I do definitely disagree with them. Okay. Greed is not a problem. I can be as greedy as I want. And unless I have some way to force something upon you, that greed goes nowhere. Like, for instance, let's say I got this tape measure here. Okay. This is a nice tape measure. It's called Fast Cap, and I recommend it Just want to point it out because, like, let me show you. See if I can get it up here on the screen. Get it up really close. As you can see, it has the fractional measurements on both sides. So I really like that. How this it's really nice when you're using it. Anyway, side. So let's say I wanted to sell you this. Now I bought it, I think, for like $7.99. But let's say I was greedy and you were like, man, I don't have one. I would like to buy one. And I'll say, I will sell you this for $15, like double. And it's used. And I think this one is actually the broke one. Is it broken? No, this is the good one. So I have, let's say it's the broken one that I have downstairs, which doesn't hold, it doesn't clip. It doesn't hold the tape measure in place. So let's say I decided I want to sell you the broken one for double the amount that I paid for it. That sounds pretty greedy. If you agree, then we're back to the nature of what I believe every transaction involves, which is two parties deciding that they're better off with what the other party has than what they're trading for it. So if you decide to give me $15 for this broken tape measure, and then what you have basically said, the signal that I can consider here is that you were telling me that you would rather have the tape measure over your $15. Now, if you decline, you're like, $15, are you crazy? I could go buy 2 of those on Amazon, and then you probably would, right? Well, then you've determined that no, having my broken tape measure is not worth more to you than the $15 that I'm asking for. But if I ask you for $1, then you might change your mind. You might say, "Oh yeah, okay." So now my greed, it was not there at all, right? So again, the point here being, greed doesn't force somebody to make a transaction. And so I disagree with this idea about footing the bill for financial institutions' greed. What it should say is, to be sure, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were flawed companies that made several bad business decisions, and taxpayers should never again have to foot the bill for any financial institution. That's it, right there. It doesn't matter whether they're being greedy or whether they're making a reasonable decision. It doesn't matter. Taxpayers should not have to pay for it. Okay. So just wanted to clarify that. Let's go on. But as policymakers look to the future of U.S. housing finance, they must seek smart reforms that focus on what was broken in the previous system while maintaining what worked for decades. The federal government must continue to play a key role in the housing market. I disagree at that point, regardless of whether it works through Fannie and Freddie, a new agency, or purely private firms. So I disagree with they must continue playing a key role. However, let's be clear, they will continue to play a key role. So we as taxpayers need to inform ourselves and say, no, that is not acceptable, or yes, that is acceptable. So let me, and I forgot to hit my little bell. So on the first item here, so on the issue of the auto pen, I'm going to give Trump. Why did my button not work? That's interesting. Let me see here. Oh, there we go. Hold on. I'll get it fixed. How about this? There we go. So we're giving him a thumbs up on that one. I'm good with investigating the auto pen because we have checks and balances. There's a limitation on what he can do in the first place. And I think that the number one role of government is to protect our rights. The number two role is to present information so that we can be an informed population. So if they know something, they have an obligation to tell us. So if they know, hey, here's what happened with Biden, they should be telling us. And then on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I do support President Trump's idea of privatizing it. However, the devil is in the details. So it may be a good idea. It may not be so good. It may be no better than what we have right now, right? Other than the fact that maybe taxpayers aren't footing the bill. But it's like, for me, I look at it and I say, I want to know what's going to give the best result to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and its customers, basically the people that are getting loans. Any regulation is interference in the marketplace. Any. So keep that in mind. And oftentimes, government interference is downplayed, and people will focus on an entity's actions. So, for instance, the article I just read, which I thought was pretty good, they still highlighted, and they're like, yeah, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they made some bad business decisions. but then they didn't address whether or not any regulations were whether those decisions were a result or in any way were informed. I don't want to say informed, but influenced by regulation. And if they were, well, then you have bad decisions, but you also have bad regulations or bad legislation. So that needs to be considered. Okay, so let's go to intermission. We'll come back. We're going to talk about a couple more things, and then we'll head on out of here. So thank you guys so much. We'll be right back. Hey, Liberty fam, do me a favor. If you enjoy the show, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button to my channel. And for the really serious folks out there, I want you to hit that bell so that you never miss an episode. By the way, if you want to support the show, head over to libertydad.locals.com and sign up. For $5, you can be part of this show. There, I'll engage supporters of the show. We'll discuss topics that you want me to talk about, response videos that you would like to see, or anything related to the show. And I'll even have a monthly subscribers only episode. By the way, I'm always looking for dads to join me for Dad Talk. That's my series where I invite everyday dads on to talk about what's important to them in the context of being a dad. No argument, no debate, and dads choose the topic. It's my way of raising dad voices. If you're a dad or you know a dad who has something to say, let's get connected. Episodes air live on Friday mornings or Friday evenings, whichever works best for dads. All right, let's get back to the show. All right, we're back. I have like a dryness in my throat, so apologies for that. So here's another thing that came up with Trump. This was interesting. There's not really a whole lot to say here, but I thought it was kind of interesting. So let's see. Let me read this on the screen. Another very big and successful week of wins for Republicans in Florida, a state that I love, and won big in 2016, 2020, and 2024. The Republican Party of Florida's voter registration lead over Democrats is now over 1.25 million, a new and record level of success. Florida's largest county, Miami-Dade, has flipped red to a Republican majority in voter registration, and Republicans lead in a total of 59 out of 67 counties across the state. Trump was the first Republican presidential candidate to win Miami-Dade since 1988. Thank you, Florida. Make America great again. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. Why did I bring this up? Well, I mean, it's a win for him, right? To get a county flipped that hasn't been Republican for, let me see if I could do the math. Let's see, 1988. So add 2, and that's going to be to 1990. Add 10, that's going to get us to 2000. So that's 12. And then we've got 25, right? 2025. So 25 plus 12, 37 years, right? So in 37 years, it's been blue, and then Trump is the one to get it flipped. All right. Congrats to him. Little kudos there. You won. Now, am I shilling for the Republican Party? No, I am not. I'm just saying, like, look, yeah, you got it. It's a clear win. It's very obvious. And as we know, with Trump, he has a lot of bluster. Like everything is like, whenever something is good and makes him look good, it's always the greatest in the world. Like, oh man, this is great. He'll be like, this mouse here, this mouse I created the best mouse. I have the best designs. I blah, 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 just go on. And it could be like a simple mouse, right? Like it just beef it up. Like, and you're like, man, that mouse, like, what does that mouse do? Is that mouse like Alexa and a laptop, and a TV all together? Will it do my dishes? Like, you're like, wow, this is really impressive. And then it turns out he's just, embellishing like crazy. But in this particular case, he's not embellishing. He did win big in Florida, and so he deserves the credit, because I think it's important to say, okay, in this particular case, yeah, you got it right, you're correct, and in this case, go, nah, bro, you're way off on that. Right? I think that's what we should do as citizens, because he is the president, and we need to hold him accountable. But we also need to give him the kudos when he does something right. Like, to me, that's the best way to play the political game, is to say, okay, yep, you got it right here. I'm totally going to acknowledge it. I'm not going to take away your win. And then over here, when they get that wrong, be like, just hammer them. Be like, the hell were you thinking? Right. I think that's how we would be better off than what we're doing right now, which is playing team sports. So just wanted to say that. Good for you. Not much. Let's get into this next item here, which is this is related to Sudan. So, all right. So it's a longer tweet. Okay. So a federal judge in Boston who knew absolutely nothing about the situation or anything else, has ordered that 8 of the most violent criminals on earth curtail their journey to South Sudan and instead remain in Djibouti. He would not allow these monsters to proceed to their final destination. This is not the premise under which I was elected president, which was to protect our nation. The judges are absolutely out of control. They're hurting our country, and they know nothing about particular situations or what they are doing. And this must change immediately. Hopefully, the Supreme Court of the United States will put an end to the quagmire that has been caused by the radical left. If this is not worked out quickly and the world is watching, our country will be under siege again with hundreds of thousands of hardened criminals breaking down the walls. We were also forced to leave behind, in order to watch these hardened thugs, a large number of ICE officers who would otherwise be in the United States protecting our citizens. Okay, there's a lot here. So let me pull up this Guardian article. Okay, I think that's the direction we want to go. Let's see. Do we want to do? No, let's continue on. Let's take a look at, because I got a couple of other slides here, or images or whatnot. So let's take a look at this one. So here, well, let's back up real quick. Let me just read this. I'm going to put this. Let me move some things around on my screen here so I can see these a little bit better. So these were, quote, monsters. He also said these are the most violent criminals on earth. Okay, that's what he said. So I want to show you something. And let's see, you're not gonna be able to read that. So let me do. Let's do this. Um, Let me try and make this a little bit bigger on the screen so that you can kind of see. Okay, so there we go. This one, the number one person. Now, this is the most violent person on earth. Enrique Hero, convicted of homicide and armed robbery. Oh, that convicted of false impersonation of an official, kidnapping, and robbery strong arm. Now, those are serious deeds. But does that really rise to the level of like the most violent criminal on earth? Like they committed crimes that happen all the time in the U.S. and everywhere else. That doesn't seem like the like. Remember, remember the movie Scarface, and they had the violent chainsaw scene. Like, you didn't actually see the guy get cut with the chainsaw, but they had a guy, he was bound. He was in the bathroom and his arms were bound over the shower curtain, and he's got his mouth duct taped. And then they don't show it, but you get the gist that they chopped him up while he was alive with a chainsaw. I believe that actually happened, right? Like, we have had violence that gruesome. Okay, like when they made that movie, they went and they looked at what some of the violent gangs were doing, and some of these violent gangs did some very, very vile stuff. But homicide and armed robbery are like common crimes. They shouldn't be. Don't get me wrong, and I'm not downplaying the seriousness. I'm just saying, like, are these 8 really the most violent, or is he just exaggerating? All right, so let's see. Let's look at this. Let's look at the second one here. All right, all right. So we got Jose Manuel Rodriguez Quinones, convicted of attempted first-degree murder with a weapon. Attempted. Convicted of battery and larceny. Convicted of cocaine possession and cocaine trafficking. I mean, is he a movie star? Because this almost looks like movie star level. Cocaine, battery, and larceny. Like, I've seen movie stars with this level of problems. All right, let's see. Let's look at the next one. This guy looks serious. He look angry. Fannie Nila Kaut, convicted of first-degree murder and robbery. Murdered a German tourist visiting family in Los Angeles, California. Okay, murder is a serious deal. They should people that hurt other people, whether it's a simple punch in the face or murder, they should be punished. Okay? But again, what we're talking about is, do these crimes rise to the level that we would say that seems like he's the most dangerous person on the planet? No. Then we've got this next guy here, Jesus Munez Gutierrez, convicted of second-degree murder. All right. I mean, how many second-degree murder convictions do we have in this country every year? Right. So I'm not buying it. Let's see. Let's take a look at this next guy. Dion Peter Demock, convicted of robbery and possession of a firearm. I mean, that's an everyday thing here in Jacksonville. Maybe not every day, but you get the point. Member of an armed robbery crew operating in Lincoln, Nebraska. Like, I didn't even know that armed robbery crews still existed. That's kind of wild. Like you got a getaway driver. Like okay, it's like the bank robbers. Like people still rob banks. People still have crews for this thing. Okay, whatever. But again, that doesn't sound like the most dangerous criminal on the planet. Convicted of possession of burglar's tools and possession of defaced firearm. You know what burglar tools are? That's a lock picking kit. You had a lock pick kit, probably. That's what I assume it meant. You know, burglar's tools, lock picks, because it's illegal to have them if you're not a locksmith in many states. And so he's the most violent criminal on the planet because of robbery, possession of a firearm. He was part of a crew. He had a lockpick kit, and he was driving under the influence. Woo! Such danger. Like I wouldn't want to run into this guy. Come on. Jeez. Okay, let's take a look at this guy here. Convicted of lascivious acts with a child victim less than 12 years of age. Okay, now that might rise pretty close to some of the most vile people on the planet. When it comes to crimes against children, like all of a sudden, my bar for punishment, how do I want to say it? My appetite for punishment goes up. Okay. Additionally charged with sex abuse in the second degree and assault with intent to commit sexual abuse. Okay. They're not really clear exactly what happened there. And honestly, just by reading that, not sure I want to know the details just because I value my own sanity. But, you know, like this guy might rise close to that level. But again, if we're talking about, so there was a story, and I apologize. I try to keep this really family friendly in case you got little ones in the car, but perhaps you turn it off right now for about 2 minutes or so while I tell you this story, or what have you. But there was a story that I read. I want to say it was out of Alabama, but I can't remember which state. But I believe it was a southern state for sure. And a man broke into a woman's house, and I think she was home with her two children, two toddlers or children. I can't remember, but they were definitely not. They were young, 6, 7, 8, somewhere around there. And he bound the woman, and then he literally cut off the children's heads while they were alive in front of the mom, forcing her to watch, and then decapitated her. Like that would rise to the top, like me saying, like that's one of the most vile people on the planet, right? And that's worse, I would think. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I want to say it's worse than lascivious acts with a child under 12. Like that's pretty bad, right? But you see what I'm saying? Like I'm not trying to downplay the crimes here. I think the crimes are very criminal. They're very wrong, especially where you've hurt other people, right? I'm very, and then when you hurt children, very sensitive to that. But again, we're talking about the president of the United States claim that judges don't know what they're talking about and telling the American public that these judges are ruling in a way that in somehow supports allegedly the most dangerous people on the planet. He's ginning up anger at our judicial system based on fabrications, really. I mean, this guy kind of rises to it. Let's look at the next one here. I'm not even trying to say this name. Convicted of first degree sexual assault involving a victim, impregnated, mentally and physically incapable of resisting. So that's pretty bad. Even if they were an adult, that's basically attacking a child from what I can tell. There's not a lot to go on here, but if you're mentally and physically incapable of resisting, that suggests to me that perhaps you are somebody that has maybe a really low IQ, you have some sort of disorder, maybe you're Down syndrome or something like that, and you're the less functioning Down syndrome. That there are people that are a little bit that have issues, and they range in their ability to function in society. So it's hard to say, but it sounds to me like he took advantage of somebody that could not fend him off, right? Basically the same thing as a child. Charged with aggravated assault, non-family strong arm. Not really sure what that means exactly, but assault is assault. That's pretty bad. This is pretty bad. Sexual assault and impregnating somebody who cannot fight back. That's effectively a child, in my opinion. So it's pretty bad. He could be up there. But again, we have to, if we're talking about the most dangerous people on the planet, what does that mean? How do we define that? Right. And this is important. It wouldn't be as big of a deal if there was no controversy here. If Trump was deporting somebody and he was like, and nobody was pushing back, and he said, yeah, I deported some of the worst criminals. Okay, fine. No big deal. Who cares? You deported back. Like, were they bad guys? Yes, they were bad guys. Did they do vile things? Did they hurt people? Yes, they did. Okay, let's get rid of them. Fine. Right. And the hyperbole wouldn't be a problem. However, it does become a problem when now he is pushing back against another another branch of government. And he's like, hey, look, these judges, they're doing bad. And he argued, he was like, they don't know anything about the case. I mean, the judge has access to all the same files. So either like, unless Trump is withholding information, right, and saying like, okay, here are some files, you can make a decision on that, but you can't make a decision on these. Like if he's basically withholding information from the judge, which he would have to do, I would assume illegally. But let's just say that he's got information that the judge does not. Well, then perhaps he should give the judge that information, or perhaps he should spend time understanding what the judge is up to. We'll get to that in a second. Let's look at this last guy. Another bad hombre here. Convicted of first-degree murder and second-degree assault. So again, these are problems. They're bad, no question. But do they really rise to being the worst? And I say they don't. And because we're putting it in the context of what a judge has ordered, that becomes a problem, right? There are times when the exaggeration is not a big deal. There are times when the exaggeration is in fact a big deal, and we should make a big deal of it. So let's quickly get to, looking at the time here, let's quickly get to the article that I wanted to check out because I thought this was important. All right, White House, Supreme Court to block challenges. At White House asks Supreme Court to block challenges to deportation to South Sudan. Federal judge had found Trump administration violated order by sending people from other countries to African nation. We don't have to read too much here. The Trump administration asked the Supreme Court late on Tuesday to halt an order allowing people to challenge their deportations from the U.S. to South Sudan. An appeal that came hours after the federal judge overseeing the case suggested the Trump administration was manufacturing chaos and said he hoped that reason could get the better of rhetoric. I agree. I think we should use reason, not rhetoric. Where there's a time and place for rhetoric, but right now, what we're talking about is this process being followed, the proper process, is it being followed? That is not a time to deal with rhetoric. It is a time for reason. Judge Brian Murphy found the White House violated a court order with a deportation flight bound for chaotic African nation carrying people from other countries who the Trump administration said had been convicted of crimes in the U.S. Murphy said those people must get a real chance to raise any fears that being sent there could put them in danger. Now, I want to point out something because this gets so heavily contested and so debated. That's all I'm going to read of that. So debated. When the government, I said earlier, the government, they have a monopoly on force. The reason that we have the rules that we have is because when they go to flex that force, when they go to use it, they can cause serious harm to people. So therefore, we have procedures, we have processes that must happen in order to ensure that somebody is getting a fair trial, even if they are a bad guy. So the government could say DL's a bad dude and he did all these terrible, awful things, and Trump could exaggerate them all to heck. The processes that we have make sure that before Trump sends somebody like me to a foreign prison for which the circumstances of getting out or getting an appeal are much different than a prison here in the United States, if the government is wrong, are harder, right? It's much more difficult because now I'm under control of another country and I have to go by whatever rules that they have or whatever they might have rules that are amenable to me, but those rules may be disregarded if you have an authoritarian that doesn't care about them. And there are countries like that. Bukele is one of them. I've pointed out in the past where there have been many arguments that he himself is disregarding rule of law in order to impose his own rule of law. So imagine if I got sent to El Salvador And then it turned out, hey, the government got it all wrong. I wasn't even the right dude, which happens. What if any one of those guys we found out who is convicted, but what if we found out later, actually, we got to overturn the convictions because these weren't the right guys. These guys didn't do it. Now, it's possible, right? What you have to remember, folks, even if you're anti-immigrant, a mistake can be made with a US citizen as well as an immigrant. That's still possible. And when there's a mistake, it needs to be corrected. If we start sending immigrants to third world prisons and the information isn't airtight, the evidence isn't 100%, and we find out later that something is up, getting them back and punishing them the way we should have becomes more difficult. And if it becomes more difficult with immigrants, if we accept it with immigrants, it's not a far leap before we might accept it with citizens. And the Trump administration, as we pointed out in the past on the show, it has already said that they were looking into how do you say it? Not really deporting, but sending, what's the word I'm looking for? It's an R word. I forgot the word. I'll remember it later. But it's sending American citizens who are guilty of crimes to a foreign prison. Right now, why would they want to do that? They want to do that because it is, it's cheaper. And the likelihood of them getting out is lower. So it's kind of like this way of like, hey, we're better protecting Americans. So it's like one of those, the road paved to hell, roads paved to hell, made of gold. Um, I'm butchering that. I need more coffee. But anyway, you get my point, right? The point being, like, just because somebody might deserve it doesn't necessarily mean we should disregard our processes, because those processes are in place to ensure that we can quickly remedy the issue if it turns out that we were wrong. Because at the end of the day, if you tell me that we want to send somebody who is a shoplifter, like let's say that somebody shoplifted, okay, and that's the extent of their crime, but they're accused of being a murderer. Let's say they murdered a whole family, like that's the accusation. And then we go through the process. They're convicted, and then we send them off to a third world prison. But then later, some human rights organizations dig in deeper, and they go, "Wait a minute, there's evidence here that you guys didn't consider, or here's some evidence that this person actually is not a killer. They just committed petty theft." Well, then the question is America really great if we're sending people for petty theft to prisons? Third world prisons at that. Is that what makes America great? No, because one of the things that makes America great is our protection of people from government. That was literally the entire reason that our government system was set up the way that it is, to protect people from an overbearing government. And if we're not protecting people, we are disregarding the whole point of this country. That doesn't mean that we can't punish people. That doesn't mean that we should drag it out for endlessly forever. That just means that when we're making the decisions, we need to make them rationally and on the basis of the best information possible. And we need to make sure that the harsher the punishment, the more sure we are. If we end up, and I know a lot of libertarians oppose the death penalty, but let's say that we sentence somebody to death and then they go and they're put to death. We should never find a situation where, oops, that guy was the wrong guy. That should never, ever happen. And if that means that rather than putting them to death, we keep them in a prison, then so be it, right? If that means we let them go, this is uncomfortable, also, so be it. The answer to, oh, we let this guy go because the government didn't have their act together and this person likely was a real killer, but the procedures, the policies, the processes were followed to the point where this person got let go, then we rethink, okay, what do we do to ensure that the next time this happens, we have our act together, we get it right so this person doesn't get let go? It is not an opportunity to say, well, let's just give out the harshest punishment and let's do it quickly, clandestinely, so that judicial review doesn't have time to say, whoa, 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 hold up on the brakes. Because that's really all that's happening. At the end of the day, Trump's argument with the judiciary branch is simply the judiciary right now is pretty much saying, you need to slow down. You need to do this right. They're not actually telling, like the Supreme Court has ruled that he can do some of the things he's doing. He just has to do it in a certain way to ensure that we got the right person and we have applied the right remedy or the right punishment to the right crime, to the right person who committed that crime, right? That's what we're trying to do. Now, if somebody came here illegally and you support deportations, fine. I disagree with you. If their only crime is coming here illegally, I disagree with you. So if they're coming here and their only crime is being here illegally, they should not go to a third world prison. That does not make America look great. Now, if you want to say, well, they should be deported, okay, fine. Our laws do say that. You can make that argument. And if you go through the processes, the only thing that I can argue is that we need a different set of processes. But I can't argue that you did it the right way and that you gave them due process, which is what's currently being argued right now. That is the whole issue. Trump is trying to make things happen in such a way that he can't be stopped, right? And this is important because what if one of those 8 guys didn't commit that crime that they're accused of? What if? Well, we're sending them, but right now I think they're still in Djibouti, so they're not yet in Sudan. But let's say they get to Sudan, and we later find out that one of them didn't commit it. But we also find out that in that prison they were killed. Okay, and people might say, "Well, yeah, but they were illegal." Okay, so let me ask you: do we send people to death because they came here illegally? Is that really what we want America to be known for? Would you be willing to basically pull that trigger? Because look, let me tell you, if you support deportation, right? And you support people being deported just for the pure fact that they're here illegally, pulling the trigger, if you will, to send them home to live their life back in their home country, that's one thing. And most people probably would be willing to do that. Pulling the trigger to send them somewhere where they could die, which is effectively the same thing as pulling the trigger yourself. I think a lot of people would have reservations about that, right? So don't ask somebody to do the dirty work for you that you're unwilling to do. And don't ask somebody to do dirty work that's really going to make the country look bad. If you actually care about America, you care about America being the best, and not just being seen as the best, but that too, but actually being the best. Part of being the best means we have the most robust and desirable criminal system in the world, which means when it's time to punish somebody, we get it right and we punish them appropriately. I'm not against punishments. And it also means if we get it wrong, we've punished somebody appropriately with proportionality such that we can fix it or we can undo it. You really can't fix it because you can't change what you've done, right? If somebody's been in jail for 10 years, you can't undo that, but you can let them go. So that's where I stand. So on that one, I'm going to say it's a fail. It's a fail. Well, I want to say it's because the other point that I want to address is if you notice, the Trump administration is appealing to the Supreme Court. So all those crazies out there that are like, you know, Trump is disregarding the rule of law. In some ways, yes, but he's also still deferring to the Supreme Court. And he's also still, as far as I can tell, abiding by their decisions for the most part. I mean, there's some things where like he's done some stuff and he, technically disregarded some order or something like that. But for the most part, he's pretty much following it. Like he's doing what I would expect any branch to do, like to push their boundaries and see what happens. Right now, I don't like it necessarily. I don't think he should, but we have to live in reality. And the reality is that sometimes they will push the boundaries, maybe on purpose, to see where it goes, or because they really believe something, and then that's where the checks and balances come into play. All right, so that was my show today, folks. Hope you enjoyed it. That's the catch up on Trump. Let's check out some of the comments here, and let's see what you guys are chatting about. Let's see what we got here. Looks pretty quiet on much of the social media here. Let's see here. Kagala says good reason for the good guys to have at least the same right to be armed as the bad guys. Totally agree. I support everybody being armed as much as you want. Let's see. Do. If Joe can have nukes, then so should I. Yes, I agree. By the way, when people make that argument, they're like, oh, you think people should own nuclear warheads? Have you ever considered the cost and the effort to have a nuclear warhead? Like, it's easy to say, yes, technically they should be able to because, like, what, 99% of the country can't afford it to begin with, let alone would even know what to do, how to arm it, how to use it, like any of that stuff. So it's like one of those absurd questions that I have to answer sometimes. Like people would say, oh, do you think it's okay if everybody had an F-14 Tomcat? I mean, yeah, but also before you get too mad at me, have you considered that, like, I am doing better than most people. Well, I don't want to say most, but than a lot of people. I cannot in any way, in any shape, come close to affording an F-14 Tomcat. I couldn't even buy one of the wheels. Okay. And then and then after you buy it, you got to maintain it. You got to have somewhere to store it. You got to have a landing strip somewhere to fly it. Right. So there's all these considerations. So I think the reality is that the question is absurd. I kind of get it. Should people be able to have all this crazy stuff? Yes, they should be able to. And we can set our minds at ease in knowing that most people simply could not afford it. So not an issue there. Bioweapons are potentially scarier and far easier to make. Not that I would know. I'm just a computer guy. I mean, like there's a lot of computer guys that could make that same assessment. And also, and I don't know where Kagela, if he has any knowledge of nuclear devices, but again, most people have no way of knowing how to manage them, how to detonate, how to set them up, none of that stuff. So, like, I just want to point out, like, there's a certain point when absurdity enters into the conversation. So keep that in mind when people are pressing you and say, yeah, but also in my world where people could have an F-14 Tomcat, you would have privatized roads, which means every owner of a road could say, well, you can't take off or land on my road. Well, great. Now you can't even get it in the air. Right. So there's that. All right, folks, that's my show for today. Hope you enjoyed it. I will see you guys tomorrow. And until then, have a good one. So I'll be out. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this episode informative and inspiring. Be sure to catch me Monday through Friday, 7:30 a.m. for an informed discussion on politics and culture. Make sure that you're subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer my Rumble channel, you can go to youtube.libertydad.com, or you can go to rumble.libertydad.com. While you are there, let me know how I'm doing by leaving me a comment. You can also become part of the community by heading over to libertydad.locals.com. Remember, if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you next time. But for now, I'm out.